Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to continue our discussion of how nutrients get cycled through our ecosystems by talking a little bit about the nitrogen cycle. So when we look at nitrogen in terms of its biological importance, one of the major components of our amino acids, our proteins, are those amino groups, which contains that nitrogen there. And the interesting thing about nitrogen in our environment is that 78% of the gases in the air are nitrogen or nitrogen containing compounds. And yet, the vast majority of organisms that live on Earth can't use atmospheric nitrogen directly out of the environment. And so, as a result, that nitrogen that is sitting in all of these gaseous compounds or gaseous states has to be altered, or what we talk about as fixed, before organisms can use it. The only exception here is that certain bacteria are the only organisms on our Earth that we are currently aware of that are capable of taking that atmospheric nitrogen and converting it into a form that not only they can use, but then can also be biologically available up the food chain. And so this cycle is incredibly driven by those bacterial species. So when we talk about nitrogen fixation, right, this is a process by which bacteria convert that atmospheric nitrogen, or you'll often see it as N2, so two nitrogen molecules bound together in a gaseous form, and they convert that atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, or NH4+, so it's actually an ammonium ion. And they use that then to be able to make organic compounds like those amino acids. Now, some bacteria will live in these things called nodules, so these little sort of bumps here on the roots of plants, particularly legume plants, so beans, peas, clovers, that kind of thing. And in that sort of mutualistic relationship, they're getting some benefits from having this close association with the plants by getting some additional nutrients, some protection, but then they are also feeding the plant the nitrogen that the plant needs in order for it to be able to grow. Other bacteria that are nitrogen fixers can also just live directly in the soil itself. And so they'll release these nitrogen compounds that are then biologically available to plants directly from the soil if they don't have these sort of mycorrhizae or these little nodules that exist on their root system. Nitrification is another process that some bacteria in the soil can do, where they'll take that ammonium and they'll convert it into nitrates, or NO3 minus, nitrate ions. Again, that nitrate ion is then biologically available to plants to be able to convert into amino acids or other nitrogen compounds that they require. The other interesting thing is that this nitrification process, while most of it is being driven by bacteria in the soil, can also be accomplished by lightning. And so lightning storms can also help to fix nitrogen in this form by combining it with oxygen in the atmosphere and releasing those nitrates that can then be available to living things as well. So when we look at sort of major processes in the nitrogen cycle, a lot of this really is that connection to bacteria in the soils and the plants, and the plants will then drive it up the food chain as other consumers eat those plants or eat up the food chain. So once that nitrogen is fixed, whether it's through nitrogen fixation or whether it's through that nitrification process, plants can then take up that nitrogen either in the form of those nitrates or those ammonium ions, and they'll take them up through their roots. And they'll take them from those roots either through those nodules like we saw in those legume plants, if they have them, or they can take it directly from the soil itself. The plants then are going to use those nitrogen compounds, that ammonium or those nitrates, to form amino acids, link those amino acids together and make proteins. The animals in our ecosystems will then get those nitrogen forming compounds, those amino acids, from the plants that they're eating or from other animals who somewhere down that food chain eventually were primary consumers eating those plants. Decomposers are going to play a major role in this as well, and most of those guys are bacteria too, where they will be able to break down those bodily wastes, so things like the urine and the feces, as well as the bodies themselves when organisms pass, leaves, other dead stuff, all of this living material that is now laying in the soil, and they will return that nitrogen to the soil as ammonium. So while certain bacteria are taking atmospheric nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turning it into ammonium, the decomposers are also taking the amino acids and the proteins and things that are existing in this dead living material and returning nitrogen to the soil as ammonium as well. Other bacteria will change that nitrogen in the soil into a gaseous form and actually help complete the cycle. So they'll sort of do the reverse, take that ammonium and return it back into nitrogen gas, which then gets returned to the air and thus completes our cycle. So if we sort of look at this, right, here's that nitrogen in the atmosphere. We'll have some nitrogen fixing bacteria that live in those root nodules, some that will just kind of hang out in the soil. Those guys will produce that ammonium. Okay, that ammonium can then be converted into nitrates through nitrogen fixate or through nitrification, excuse me. Other nitrifying bacteria will also create those nitrates, and that can then get assimilated into the plants. Denitrifying bacteria will take some of those nitrates that are just hanging out in the soil, return the nitrogen, and decomposers, whether it's bacteria or fungi, will take all of that dead material, return it to ammonium, and complete the process here where nitrification creates those nitrates, nitrates get denitrified, return the nitrogen back to the atmosphere. So what sort of things do humans do that sort of disrupt this cycle? And one of the biggest ones is the nitrogen is a major component of fertilizers. And think about it, that makes sense. If we're trying to grow plants and crops, then they need the nutrients that they require in order to do that growing process. So nitrogen is one of those major components. The problem becomes that historically we have just sort of dumped copious amounts of fertilizer without really any regard to how much is truly necessary. And those plants can only take up so much out of the soil. And so what ends up happening is that excess fertilizer the plants can't absorb and utilize ends up in our groundwater, ends up running off farmland into local streams and rivers, and eventually all of this gets dumped into these major aquatic ecosystems. Um, One of the biggest ones that has been very well studied is the Chesapeake Bay because its watershed, its water table is coming from places like Lancaster. And what is Lancaster known for? Amish and farming. So that excess fertilizer being run off the land and ending up into these aquatic ecosystems does a really interesting thing to the algae that naturally grow there. They are producers, and so if we give them this excess amount of nitrogen, all of a sudden their ability to grow and reproduce just goes crazy. And so we get these things called algal blooms, where you just get this crazy layer of algae that just builds up on top of the surface. And the unfortunate part of that is that when they do that, they deplete the deeper waters underneath them of all of the oxygen that is bubbled into that ecosystem. And so they basically choke out the oxygen from down here. Well, what does that mean? Our cute little fishies who live down here, other aquatic plants that may live closer to the bottom of ecosystems where sunlight is capable of penetrating. All of that ends up creating this anoxic environment, depleting those organisms of the oxygen that they need in order to do processes like cellular respiration. So what happens? They die, they get decomposed, and the process of decomposition depletes the oxygen levels even further. And so you end up with this incredibly anoxic environment where these organisms aren't capable of living. Um, we're blocking sunlight as well, so that's not penetrating down here to help bubble out some additional oxygen. And it just creates this really unstable ecosystem to the point where it's potentially capable of just killing it off entirely. So, my husband actually happens to teach in Lancaster, and the bio department at his high school actually does field stream studies of some of the local farms to see how much of their fertilizer is actually ending up in those streams, which is a potential monitoring system to see how much excess fertilizer is ending up in their water tables and potentially running off into the Chesapeake um, downstream. And when you think about it, from an economic standpoint, it makes sense. Why am I dumping more fertilizer onto my crops if they don't need it, right? So everybody kind of wins here. So we figure out how much fertilizer is actually necessary, which means we're not wasting resources and money, and we are saving the aquatic ecosystems down the watershed. Other things that we also do that can impact the nitrogen cycle are the burning of woods and fossil fuels. So just like those burning of woods and fossil fuels puts in carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and can have impacts on climate change, by burning these types of fuels, it also creates nitric oxide, and that not nitric oxide also ends up in the air. So what happens is when that nitric oxide ends up in the air, it combines with oxygen and water and ends up forming nitric acid. Well, if you've ever heard of acid rain, this is where it's coming from. So burning those fuels, burning those woods from lots of major industrial processes, factory processes, doesn't actually end up affecting directly next to the factory, which is why it's been so hard to sort of maybe convince people that this is a problem and this is where that problem is coming from. Because what it ends up doing is that all of that ends up in the atmosphere, gets condensed into some of that cloud formation as part of that conversion process, but those clouds generally don't rain right back down where they have been formed. Instead, they'll get carried off by wind patterns, weather patterns, and end up creating that acid rain or acid snow downstream. So when we look at some of the major impacts of factories and things like that from places like Detroit and Chicago, they're not necessarily seeing the direct impact of that acid rain, but it was being seen into Ohio and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and into the East Coast. So when we talk about acid rain, I'll show you a map of sort of the downstream effect. Why do we care? Well, first and foremost, remember we're talking about creating a adjusted pH environment, right? More acidic, lower on the pH scale. And remember when we talked about proteins? Proteins are incredibly susceptible to pH changes, right? They need to be able to fold and shape properly so that they can do their job. If they end up in an environment where they are being disrupted, and pH can be one of those major environmental factors. If we lower the pH too much, those proteins start unraveling and they're not able to do their job as well. Or if we unravel them enough, they can't do their job at all. And that has huge effects downstream of the function of trees and grasses and plants. And if it runs into aquatic ecosystems, to the fish and crayfish and all sorts of organisms that live there. And if we're killing off the primary productivity of that ecosystem because we've disrupted the pH so much that they can't function, that's going to have dire effects of the food chain when there's no food left to eat. Um, so definitely something we have to be aware of. So can we sequester some of that gas and be able to maybe filter it or convert it into something else that is less toxic? Can we adjust the way that we are burning things? Can we burn different things? Lots of things to look at in terms of a sustainability standpoint to prevent this from being a huge issue down the line.